And thank you very much, and a warm welcome to all of you here, at least virtually, partially here in Berlin, for our session of integrating quality into economic and firm performance indicators. And I'm very delighted to have a distinguished panel with us today. And I would say, actually, I couldn't think of a better panel to discuss these questions. In alphabetical order, we have Andreas Barko, the chair of the International Accounting Standards Board in London. We have Melanie Kreis, member of the Board of Management, CFO of the Deutsche Post DHL Group. We have Hanna Zetterberg, affiliate researcher, among others, at the Center for Financial Reporting and Auditing here at ESMT. And we have, and this is particularly remarkable given all the other obligations and commitments today, Dennis Noah, the president of the Global Solutions Initiative, so the host today. It is great to get together here, given that we see on both the corporate and the macroeconomic level, the need and the wish to integrate qualitative factors into measuring. And just to provide you with some examples on it, on the macroeconomic side, we've seen now for a number of years, you could even say for more than a decade, the wish to integrate quality indicators into the gross domestic product. And there have been different initiatives by policymakers, but it's also very remarkable, just to use the German example, that for the first time this year, in the yearly economics report by the German Federal Ministry of Economics and Climate, there was an addition to the regular GDP reporting, in that there were also quality indicators being given. Likewise, on the corporate side, we have seen over the recent years an intense debate on what non-financial information is, what actually should be included in yearly reporting, and in particular, what are the non-financial information indicators that should be included most, that are most valuable to be included. And the purpose for our discussion today is, first of all, to take stock and to see where do we actually stand on both sides, on the macroeconomic side as well as on the corporate side, to see what actually really makes qualitative factors the ones that should be reported on the macroeconomic and on the corporate side. And then, as Global Solutions is always very action-oriented, to also see how these two dimensions could be integrated, to basically start a discussion that hopefully will not only end today, but rather provide an impulse for the years to come, or the weeks, months, years to come, on how this could be integrated. So with this, I would like to start asking our panelists, basically in the domain they feel most comfortable with, how they view these qualitative indicators on the corporate or on the macroeconomic side. And I would like to start with Melanie Kreis as the CFO and who is of Deutsche Post DHL, who actually obviously is asked by financial markets to provide meaningful qualitative indicators. So what are your thoughts about which ones you should take and how to best integrate them?
Okay, Jörg, how much time do I have? Because that's obviously a very broad question. So maybe just 3 sentences about the company I represent here. We are from the real world. We are the largest logistics company globally, Deutsche Post DHL Group, which is great, but that also means that we have a significant CO2 footprint, 39 million tons of CO2. At the end of last year, we employed 590,000 people, so a very large S responsibility. And we're present in 220 countries and territories, which means that good governance on the G pillar is absolutely paramount. Having said that, I thought back over the weekend when I prepared for that panel, we actually started preparing our first environmental and social reports way back in 2003. And it then evolved over time. We followed the GRI methodology. And I think when I think back 15 years ago, it was mainly about showing as a company that you were thinking about the non-financial topics. And there was a very broad spectrum of topics you could potentially cover. And our external reporting grew and grew. And by 2015, we published 150 pages of non-financial reporting. Yeah? So we saw this enormous breadth on topics to be covered because there were stakeholders demanding this or that or the other. At the same time, there was no consistent methodology. Yeah, so you were asked to talk about many topics, but there was no clear description on how, in what methodology you should do that. And I think what we are now seeing at the moment is that somehow both trends converge. We are asked as a company to still report on more and more and more KPIs across the ESG spectrum. We are getting more and more prescriptions, sometimes different variations of the truth from different standard setters on how we should report on those. And that whole thing currently gets to a point where it is A, difficult to manage, and B, also not really adding value anymore. Because you can first of all confuse stakeholders by giving too much information in different forms and sizes. And it is also beginning to really distract us internally from the most important thing, which is after all not reporting great KPIs, but doing something about the underlying challenges, like for example, reducing our CO2 footprint. So I think for me, we are now at a point where we have to take a step back and we have to find a pragmatic approach to focus on the most relevant topics, which may then be different. There may be a set for all, a set by sector, and a set for certain companies, to introduce materiality thresholds, and to then rather have good quality on fewer KPIs in agreed standards than exponentially growing reporting universe out there. So much in terms of initial problem statement, and I look forward to discussing the solution with you.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I'll pass this on to Andreas, because I remember, so Andreas and myself have a history which dates back of the Board of Trustees meetings of the ISSB. And I know, at least in the last meeting here in Germany, there was also an intense discussion about this topic. And now, given now basically the vast variety of KPIs, and looking at this from, say, a standard setter's perspective, Andreas, what is your approach?
Well, thanks for having me. Great opportunity to speak to you. I could really build from where Melanie left. So let me give a slight background to that. The IFRS Foundation until last year comprised one standard setting organization, which was devoted to developing financial reporting standards. And the mission that we have is actually to serve global capital markets by increasing accountability, efficiency, and transparency. So in the end, our public policy mission was really one of financial stability and not one particularly devoted to ensuring or fostering social justice or a clean environment or things like that. Now, things obviously have changed a bit because our parent organization, the IFRS Foundation, have initiated a sister board to the IASB, which is the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is charged with developing sustainability disclosure standards. Now, obviously, we take our respective mandates very seriously. And when I think about adding quality indicators, my first question is, what do we mean by adding or by integrating or incorporating? Because what we hear quite loudly from investors and capital markets is, please leave the financial statements as clean as they are. Don't convolute these with other measures. And I must say, theoretically, and that's the part-time academic in me, I obviously attribute a lot of value to approaches such as those being promulgated by the Value Balancing Alliance or by the Impact Weighted Accounts Project of Harvard, and there are obviously quite a few others that aim at, in the end, bringing externalities caused by an entity back into the performance measurement of a company. And I say, as the part-time academic, I like that approach, because if you think about the performance of an entity, and Melanie alluded to the big carbon footprint of her company, obviously it is arguable whether the profits being declared at each and every annual general meeting or quarterly meeting are really that, or whether they should be decreased to take into account at least part of the externalities that are being caused by the entity. So much for the theoretical background. Now, to my knowledge, for the last 200 years, several people have struggled and all have failed and actually make this work, right? Because it's a bright idea, but it's not easy to be done. And what works for some companies, what works for some sectors might not work on a global scale. So probably coming up with something that may work for all companies, at least in a rough sense, might be the way to go. Now, coming back to my prior statement, that doesn't seem to be what capital market participants in particular want us to do. Because as I said, they want the financial reporting as learned today be remaining as clean as possible to provide a robust basis for modeling and forecasting. So what we are hearing is the entire ESG indicators for them are really part of risk reporting that apply once they take the clean financial performance number, forecast a stream of future cash flows, and then apply the ESG metrics to tinker with that stream of future cash flows. For instance, saying we adjust the future revenue stream, or we put in some carbon taxes that we know will be imposed down the line. So it just gives them another reference point to making the future forecast more reliable. And in that sense, obviously, I could say mission accomplished for my board, more or less. All the work now rests with the ISSB to come forward with metrics that people could agree on, that are being utilized by jurisdictions in the same way that accounting standards are being utilized around the globe to form a global basis and to foster global comparability. Now, my last statement is only that I wouldn't steer myself away by just saying mission accomplished, you don't need me on this panel. I pass it on to the ISSB, because surely the bridge between financial reporting and sustainability related disclosures needs to be revisited and needs to be adjusted. So if you think about a Venn diagram where one circle actually represents the universe of financial reporting and another circle represents sustainability reporting, these circles do overlap to a fair degree. And it is the lens that we ought to both have a look at and think about what the potential cross implications may be. I shall stop here.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And let me actually use this to go right away to Hannah. Hannah, you're not only an outstanding academic, but you also come from a region of the world that has always been pioneering in the sense of trying to integrate what we just heard as challenges. What is your view on this?
Thank you, Jörg, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. So maybe to reveal what part of the world I'm from, maybe you can hear it from my accent, but I'm from Sweden. So not in Berlin, which the picture shows, but I'm affiliated researcher to ESMT. So I've been doing research on this topic, and especially I come from this capital market perspective. So how does really analysts and portfolio managers use this type of information? How do they try to integrate this into their analysis? And I really recognize the things that we heard here before from Melanie and Andreas, that they are struggling. They want to anchor in the financial performance and then take a broader view about performance in mind when they look at the future company performance. So both, I think, they struggle with two things. They struggle with financial materiality. So even looking at forecasting those future cash flows that Andreas was talking about, they have some problems with seeing the link of the non-financial KPIs to see how those can be informative about the actual financial performance in the firm in the future. They also struggle with thinking about what are externalities and how could they become risks and opportunities in the future for the firm. I think this total performance perspective is something that there are a lot of things happening in this area, right? When it comes to disclosure and having a good set of non-financial metrics is a good start. But I think what we're seeing now, and I hope we can discuss that more and more, is this trend of monetizing. So even not if we should, I agree with Andreas that most of the actors that I talk to, they don't want to alter the financial statements. They want to have it as they are. But if we can have monetizing externalities could help financial and capital market participants to value the magnitudes of these effects, and also, of course, how can we make trade-offs between different aspects that should be important. So monetization, I think, even though we don't alter the financial statements going forward, I think that's one way forward. Another thing, and I guess Andreas also touched upon this, what these investors and analysts want is, of course, they want material information. They want information that it helps them to answer the question, how is this company performing now, in the future, and should I invest? And I guess they don't want too much information, exactly like Melanie said, the GRI reporting and the types of all metrics that tailors to all stakeholders need, they get very frustrated. That's what comes out in our research. So they want materiality, but they also want comparability. So I guess one way of solving that is, of course, to have a small set of indicators that goes for all firms. And here we want to cover, of course, the E, some of the most important environmental issues, like carbon and also biodiversity, S and the G. So we get a small set, and then we can add on sector-specific KPIs and firm-specific KPIs. I think that's what the investor community, at least what I've met in the research that we've been doing, that's their wishes. That's close there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Hannah. And I would like to actually use, as you mentioned, this term externalities. I mean, that is obviously a big factor for macroeconomic thinking, or let's say economic thinking overall, for measurement there. And with this, I would like to turn to Dennis, who actually has pioneered this idea of bringing this together. Dennis, from what you hear now more, you could say from the corporate perspective, how would you value this in light of your thoughts and, as I said, your pioneering work more on the, so to say, economic measurement side?
I'm delighted to be on this panel because it highlights a number of big issues across the macroeconomic versus corporate divide. On the macroeconomic side, our efforts have been concerned primarily with finding metrics for well-being, societal prosperity in a broad sense, people leading thriving lives, finding ways, inputs into that, and then seeking to find corresponding measures on the business front. This is not at all, obviously, what is being discussed within the corporate framework. And the reason why that is the case is because, at least within listed companies, you have a fiduciary duty to pursue shareholder value. And if you're not listed, but you want investors, then you need to generate profits. And that means that these other aspects, environmental and social aspects, will enter into your reporting in relevant ways only insofar as they affect your future risks. Now, that is very far removed from what does business need to do in order to make a maximally beneficial contribution to society. Now, there have been efforts to tackle this problem on business perspective, the move from shareholder value to stakeholder value. That tiptoeing past the fact that that often conflicts with the fiduciary duty of the managers of many corporations, still would not solve the problem. I mean, take the environmental problem that Melanie mentioned, CO2 footprint. If you emit X tons of CO2, that affects everyone on Earth because of the amount of mixing in the environment. But that goes far beyond the stakeholders of the firm. And therefore, there is no way that even if business wanted to, that it could go this alone in terms of making a maximally useful contribution to society as seen from the perspective of civil society or many policymakers. And therefore, I think what needs to be done is to consider what combination of government action plus business action would enable businesses in pursuit of profitability within a given institutional, legal, moral constraints to actually deliver on societal value. And that means that the government has a critical role to play in creating a level playing field among businesses and directing business activity towards things that are environmentally sustainable and also socially sustainable. There are various ways in which governments can do that, but without that, I think the only other way forward would be to reconsider what the responsibilities of businesses have to be in order to operate. Some general duties enshrined in the foundational legal responsibilities of a company, or the specific corporate purpose of a business that is societal. Those sort of things may have a big influence, but unless there is some comparability across firms, that just creates huge arbitrage opportunities. And so I think in the second round, we can consider what it would mean for the objectives of business to be more closely aligned with social objectives, environmental objectives. But I think at the moment I would just leave it there by showing what the nature of the divergence between these two ways of thinking are. What is in society's interest and what is in business interest, given the laws and regulations and norms that we have.
Thank you, Dennis. I saw Melanie, and this is actually great. So I don't even have to ask the questions, but rather pass on. I would have a couple of questions on this, but please, Melanie.
Yeah, Dennis, thank you very much. Maybe two additions from my side. The first one may be an encouraging statement from the corporate world. I think things are moving also in the corporate world. And I think from our stakeholder base, there's now much more acceptance to not just look at the financials, but also making the business sustainable. And to give you a concrete example, I mentioned that we have this very sizable CO2 footprint. We have actually committed to science-based targets and to an absolute reduction to below 29 million from 39 million by 2030, which is a very ambitious target, given that 70% of our emissions are from aviation. And we said last March that we are willing to spend 7 billion euros on this in the current decade. On that day, our share price actually went up. Yeah, so I think the things are really beginning to change. You, of course, still have to find the right balance, and being a profitable company is, of course, easier to do these things than when you're kind of like struggling with economic challenges. But I think there is an appreciation that this transformation is also not coming free of charge and that companies have to invest into it. So I think that's maybe the encouraging side. The second piece is, I think from a company perspective, we would actually only need a couple of very simple things for us to move into the right direction. The first one would be a CO2 price, where we have a very clear time horizon, how that is stepping up over time. And of course, ideally, from a company perspective, in a globally aligned way, so that there is no arbitrage. That would then automatically steer the right economic activities towards sustainable aviation fuel, which is currently still not competitive compared to traditional jet fuel. So if all I would ask from politics is a clear framework where I know how my external price is going up over time, and what is a clear and simple framework against which I have to report. And unfortunately, as we all know, for numerous well understood reasons, it's really difficult to get those two very simple things. And I'll stop here. I could say much more, but I think
this is great. Thank you.
Thank
you so much. I would like, Andreas had also raised his hand, and maybe I'd like to combine it with one observation. In 2019, the Business Roundtable in the United States basically came together to say that the time for shareholder-centric economies is over. It should now be rather stakeholder-oriented, something Europe has always prided itself of as being further along. Now there are lots of also academic studies that look at whether the statement at that point of time has really also realized in something meaningful in the meantime. Now we see from Melanie's statements, there are actually real actions being taken by companies. But maybe it would also be interesting, Andreas, if you could shed a little bit light also on this international perspective. So is this something that may actually be more common already in, so to say, traditionally stakeholder-oriented economies, or is this something that you would see and expect around the globe?
Thanks for that question. I might first again pick up from where Melanie left, because she actually mentioned the majority of the points that I was going to respond to Dennis's intervention as well. Let me come back to that after an additional remark, which just builds on Melanie's. I would think I would be a bit more optimistic, I hope, when I look into what you coined as risk reporting, or only risk reporting by companies, because I think several speakers have stressed the importance of there being a good materiality principle in place and an application of what does materiality mean. Now, it was often put forward in a derogatory way by saying materiality is only looking at what contributes to a company's financial performance, no matter what. And I think that is a short-sighted view that I must say I haven't seen being exercised, at least in many parts of continental Europe, for at least a decade. So there is clearly a shift in there. That's not to say that all business-oriented companies are now turning to become a philanthropy, right? I mean, it's not the purpose of Deutsche Post to become the greatest foundation on earth and spend all its money on saving the planet and saving lives and all of that, even if we wanted that to do. I wouldn't go as far as Friedman and saying the business of business is business, but surely I think if you take into account the power of ESG-related information that's being priced in by capital market participants in coming forward with firm valuations, I think there's a clear understanding that a risk is not just a detection risk of any environmental wrongdoing or socially intolerable behavior, but it's going far beyond. If you think about customers just turning away from a company and no longer buying products or boycotting, if you think about employees, existing employees shying away from the company, quitting and going to another firm that's actually more socially viable. New talented people no longer going to the entity. So if you all encompass that into ESG risk, I think it gives a far broader perspective. And I think over time, I would actually hold the hypothesis that what currently is being called financial materiality over time will merge largely with societal materiality. It wouldn't be the same. There will always be pieces that are left just for public policy, and I think rightly so, because as I said, financial reporting has an objective that is not per se to kill all problems that exist in the world, but really to provide financial stability. But it's not just to say we concentrate on the fast buck only and ignore all the externalities. That may have been the case some time ago, but I see that really changing. Now, to your question, Jörg, as to is there strength being visible all over the globe, or is that still largely a jurisdictional phenomenon or development? I cannot claim to have full visibility over everything, but I would just put a few things into the race. So what I clearly can see is there seems to be a northern-southern divide. If we are talking about sustainability, rightly or wrongly, this seems to be foremost a perspective that's being shared in the northern hemisphere and leaving behind many people in the southern hemisphere. And that's not by design, but it is probably because those people in the southern hemisphere have more pressing needs, more pressing problems than to care what they perceive is a luxury problem. I shouldn't be using that term because obviously there is this derogatory meaning to that. But it seems that people who cannot make their daily life work obviously are less concentrating on providing transparency around ESG, but really trying to make ends meet in the real economy before they actually think about reporting. And it is just stunning to see whenever we get advice from our advisory council, which is a body comprised of 65 people from all over the globe, there is really a clear distinction. You could tell by people responding to questions on ESG, whether they come from the northern or the southern hemisphere. And there's certainly a huge education effort that is needed in order to really broaden the perspective here. I wouldn't go as far as saying Europe is the lighthouse. Clearly, we are being seen as some, obviously, but we struggle on different accounts. If you think about the taxonomy and the fights that we just have as to is gas and nuclear green or is it not green, I might just throw something into the mix that you probably wouldn't expect. China has its own green taxonomy, and they have actually declared both gas and nuclear not as green, but actually as brown. They have built more wind power stations within 1 year than the entire rest of the world over the past 5 years. So I think we are sometimes tending to be a bit Europe-centric and just looking at what's happening here and trying to ignore what's happening in other spaces. Now, I don't want to give the perspective that everything is rosy and no further action is needed, but to just close my personal observation about the business roundtable that you cite, I have seen some researchers making the claim that this has gone close to greenwashing, because there is a lot of lip service, there's a lot of statements, but for many of these companies, there's really not the action that stakeholders think were warranted. That's not to say they're all on the same page. There's obviously a lot happening in the US. But if you just relate that to the latest regulatory initiative by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which has published a 500-page exposure draft on climate reporting, and you see the uproar this has had in the business community, which where many lawyers have stayed on second after this was published, we will sue the SEC to death. We will take this to the courts and we will stop the SEC from mandating companies putting transparency to that, it's not really that this is a common good yet. And I would just stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Hannah, I would like to actually come back to one aspect that you mentioned before, but that also an aspect that Melanie mentioned, which is basically the question of how many KPIs are, you could say, digestible. So you said a small set of factors would probably help a lot. Melanie mentioned in her first statement, also there are so many different KPIs that are asked for, but also at the same time, she asked for a very clear regulatory framework, in particular when it comes to CO2 pricing. So if I just go a little bit more in this direction that you just mentioned, what would be your preference in terms of what actually should be at the forefront of reporting?
Thank you, Jörg. That's a hard question, right? The kind of the secret number of how many KPIs would be digestible. That's really hard to tell, right? But it's definitely something that when we look at materiality and when analysts at least try to make a materiality analysis of the company they're following and try to see, okay, what are the things that we should really try to integrate, and what other things can we actually exclude for now? Somewhere between 5 and 10, that's usually what pops up if I see the analysis that I've been looking at. But then if they would be satisfied with less or could bear with more, it's hard to tell. But I think it's really, I really want to emphasize this, that when it comes to real ESG integration, many of them say, okay, how do I get this into my Excel file, right? How do I get this into my actual spreadsheet? And that's something that, regardless if they've done the materiality analysis and have 5 to 10 things that they want to focus on, they have a problem. And maybe it's a training thing as well, right? To see the links, exactly the links that Andreas also mentioned, right? What are the effects on the revenues going forward for this company that has this type of segments, that some are less sustainable than others, and what are the effects on personal expenses from health and safety issues? They are really struggling there. It's something that I can really see. But how many KPIs, I think it's hard to say. But Melanie, maybe you have a hand up.
Yeah, over to Melanie, and then obviously, then I would come back to Dennis. Melanie, please.
Yeah, I think what we really need is a pragmatic step-by-step approach, yeah, where I think it makes more sense to start with less and then build it from there. And I think for me, example of how things can develop into a challenging direction is the EU taxonomy, where we had a very simple basic idea: % of green revenue, % of green OPEX, % of green CAPEX. Super simple idea, 3 numbers. Now, then this got kind of like already more complex because activities were introduced, and activities which go in many cases not in line with how we do our financial segment reporting, yeah, which already led to the first huge mapping exercise to get from the financial segment reporting to the activity-based reporting. And then it got overloaded with the other do not significantly harm conditions. Yeah. So out of a very simple 3 KPI idea, we ended up with something which is actually like 100 KPIs. And that also leads from a company perspective to cases where actually doing the right thing is not recognized under the taxonomy. Let me give you a very concrete example. We have the largest fleet of electric delivery vehicles out there, and we burned a lot of money. And I got beaten up by financial investors for burning so much money on developing those electric delivery vehicles. We now have a fleet of 21,000 electric delivery vehicles out there. At the moment, they will not qualify under the EU taxonomy. Why? Well, they are electric, that's all great, but there's a side condition, do not significantly harm, and the noise profile of the tires does not comply with the do not significantly harm of another criteria. Unfortunately, there are no winter and all-year tires which comply with this criteria. So I can either send out my delivery guys with summer tires in the winter, or I cannot comply. And I think this is where, with the best of intentions, a very simple idea by just trying to add too much onto it, got to a point where, when I take it to the extreme, I get the same credit for driving a 20-year-old diesel and a green electric delivery vehicle at the moment under the EU taxonomy. So as tempting as it is to try and find the great unified theory and solve all problems at the same time, I think we have to be pragmatic, we have to focus, and then from a very narrow scope, we then have to add on over time. But we must not try to solve everything in the beginning. And I think that is a little bit what is happening at the moment, and that is deeply concerning because it will not lead to the right behavior.
I think this gives the perfect transition to Dennis, because also in, say, macroeconomic measuring, there is a debate on which factors should be included. Quality of life to be measured in different ways when it comes to, for example, schooling, the environment. I think what Melanie just described is also a certain trade-off, which obviously is at the center of what economists think about between different dimensions. When you look at this, what would be, so to say, your perspective on the same question from an economics or macroeconomic side?
Well, if I could say two things, this has been a fascinating discussion. With regard to your question, obviously, there are many ways of measuring human well-being. But what is crystal clear is that it is important for whatever measure that we take to be comparable across countries and through time, and that we should have a limited number of measures. So GDP is really good, okay? That's one number, and it's basically comparable across time, and it's had huge effect on the national policies. The number of things that your working memory can keep in place at one time, we used to think it was 7, but actually it's on average 4. So having 4 aggregate indicators is something that can maximally be communicated to the public. Policymakers can keep it in their minds. Business strategists, when they think about problems, can have it in working memory as well. And that was basically what guided us in designing our dashboard. We looked at what are the 4 main sources of human well-being. They're normative sources, actually. And we came up with SAGE, solidarity, that is your social embeddedness, so your sense of belonging; agency, which is your empowerment to determine your destiny through your own efforts; material gain, that is GDP, basically, and its distribution; and then E, environmental sustainability, so SAGE. And each of them corresponds to some normative background. S is communitarianism, A, agency, is classical liberalism, G, material gain, is consequentialist utilitarianism, and E is ecoethics. So, and under these you can have, a lot of disaggregated statistics, but at least those aggregate statistics should be comparable. And we need to think of something comparable to that on the business side. Now, but what exactly does that mean for business? Because things get irrelevant very quickly. If you have a fiduciary duty within the norms of society and your legal constraints to pursue shareholder value, then whatever else that you may do that you think is good for society will either be greenwashing or it'll lead to arbitrage opportunities elsewhere. So there are 2 things that limit this, that this conversation has revealed. One is social norms and values. If the shareholders, investors, employees, customers all want you to do moral things, then you'd be unwise not to do them. It's a bit like child labor and slavery. If your value chain includes that, then you'll lose a lot of appeal, and it's not in your business interests to do that. And with time, people may become sensitive enough to the environment and to social disruptions for that to figure, but we don't have the time in terms of climate change or in terms of the social fragmentation we have to wait for social norms and values to adjust sufficiently. So that's just not sufficient. The other is policy incentives. Melanie, you've always struck home so many times in this panel. You say we need a CO2 price. That is one really good example of an incentive that targets and requirements for businesses to approach net zero via CO2 price. That certainly would help businesses in the pursuit of their profits align with our environmental targets. With social targets, we're still in the Stone Age for formulating them, and CO2 is not sufficient. We need to look at climate change more broadly, but on the social side, we still have a long way to go. Another way to do it is through government policies, government procurement policy, regulatory licenses to operate, regulatory approvals, conditions for grants, tax incentives. They can all push you in a direction that will make business in pursuit of profitable opportunities align itself more. But for business to believe that even if you take the business roundtable seriously and pursue stakeholder value, it's not going to be sufficient, because the effects that you have on the environment and society far exceed your stakeholders. If you change your global value chain and decide not to hire in one part of the world but in another, and the place where you no longer hire, the community fails, that's a huge amount of social disruption. It cannot possibly appear on your stakeholder balance sheet. Therefore, you really need an interaction with the government in order to set this straight. If we would pursue that course, what does the government need to do and what does business need to do? How hopefully will values change? Then we're coming closer to a more integrative approach that will actually gain traction.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So we are reminded that we only have 4 minutes left, which just shows what a fascinating topic this is and how much more one could actually discuss on this. So maybe, therefore, I would like to use reverse order and ask Hannah, Andreas, and Melanie for their thoughts based on what Dennis just said, maybe as you could say more or less as an outlook, or what else could be done, or what could be done either on the research, the standard setting, or the practical side of things. Hannah, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Really, from my perspective, coming from the corporate, or the interaction between the investors and the analysts and the corporate side, how can we take a holistic view on company performance, right? And both the financial material issues that we've been discussing, but also then the externalities. I would love to look more into the interaction, also what Dennis says, like the policies, and when there's this issues of how to measure actually the footprints there. This is complex, right? Especially when we have global value chains. So that's something where I see, where I come from, finance and accounting and the corporate world could really interact more with research on policy and the link between.
Andreas, please.
Thanks. So my lessons learned would probably be, don't look at company reporting as the ultimate tool for solving the world's problem. I think it is auxiliary. It certainly has a role to play. Transparency is important, but for the problems that you've described, Dennis, I'm with you that the majority of those need public policy action, especially if you think we don't have the time for things to evolve. And I might just close by saying, in something as trained as financial reporting, whenever we bring forward a new accounting standard, we let companies 2 to 3 years to implement that. Now, that is a highly trained discipline. If we look into ESG reporting, this is completely new territory. It is unstructured, it is incomparable, and we can't just ascertain that the same rigor and the same quality that we wish to have for ESG reporting will prevail by the same time frames. That, I think, is simply not possible. So it will take more time. Should it be done? Clearly, it should be done, but I think it needs to be complemented by public policy action because otherwise we will lose ours on the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Melanie, please.
Yeah, very quickly building on what Andrea said, I was also really fascinated by the even broader spectrum Dennis showed. So I think, as Andrea said, the whole accounting transparency side will allow us to track progress, but I think the incentives have to be set in a different way. And I think on the reporting, which allows for the transparency and progress crediting, make sure that it's pragmatic, don't solve all problems of the world in one go. And I think also echoing what Andrea said, you have to give us time to really learn those new skills, to build up the capabilities, and not to tell us that as of next year, we have to report on something we have never done before. I think on the corporate side, the motivation is there, but the most important thing is not the accounting, but getting things moving into the right direction. And that has to be the most important imperative.
I have to sign off if I can. I'm sorry, but this has been absolutely fascinating. And
I would just like to, thank you. Thank you so much. I would just like to say thank you to our distinguished panelists. And while obviously I couldn't give justice to all the arguments that were brought forward, I think they just show why global solutions or what global solutions can provide. It's actually really the global perspective, as Andrea said. It is, as many of you said, this interaction between business and government. And it's also, as we just saw, about concrete measures that actually could be taken both on the macroeconomic side and the corporate side. So really, thank you so much for such a lively and inspiring debate, and hopefully more to come and more things to discuss. Thank you.